We're going to go over some of the science behind the vaccine and the data that was presented yesterday at the FDA advisory meeting. This is what I'd like to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about Operation Warp Speed. We're going to talk about messenger RNA vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine in particular, and its safety data, as well as the effectiveness data. So first, a word about Operation Warp Speed. This is a government industry collaboration to help safely develop therapeutics and vaccines to treat and prevent SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19 disease. The government, in regard to the vaccine, has paid for production of hundreds of millions of vaccine doses at the same time that they are being developed and tested. And we know that the vaccines that aren't approved, those doses that are already made will be destroyed. And the reason for this is so that a vaccine, once it's approved, can be immediately shipped and we don't have to wait for distribution time. There have been a lot of questions about the safety of Operation Warp Speed, and I want to compare it to the way other vaccines are developed so that you can see that it is safe and that they haven't cut corners in regard to safety. If you look at this top bar, that is the typical timeline for a vaccine development from conception to distribution, and most vaccines take about 6 years to get to the public for use. These are things like Prevnar and Menactra and HPV, all the other vaccines that we have. The scientists spend several months at the beginning of the timeline deciding what type of vaccine to make. Then they spend several months doing phase 1 trials to select a dose. You can see in those middle blue and gray bars that 21 months are devoted on average to phase 2 studies to see how safe the vaccine is, and then phase 3 studies to see how effective the vaccine is. That process usually takes almost 4 years because it's hard to find 30,000 people willing to sign up for a vaccine study. Once the other types of vaccines are approved by the FDA, which is the red dot here, it takes about 15 months to manufacture the vaccines after approval, and then about 6 months to distribute them. So you can see here it takes about 6 years to get a vaccine to market, but we don't have that time in a pandemic. So in this scenario with Operation Warp Speed, scientists initially began knowing that messenger RNA technology was looked at for SARS and for the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus. Those thoughts had already occurred even a decade ago. These platforms exist for cancer vaccines, and so the machines and the labs were already set up, and that's why messenger RNA vaccines were chosen initially. Phase 1 clinical trials looked at 12 people to see about dosing, and then you enter that time period where you need 30,000 people to volunteer for this, and in a pandemic that happened immediately. So 30,000 volunteers were vaccinated to look at safety and efficacy data quickly. Not cutting corners for safety, but there were just that many people that participated. And then during the time the vaccine is being tested, the manufacturers are actually making 100 million doses so that hopefully tomorrow we're expecting FDA approval of the vaccine for an emergency use authorization represented by the red star here. It's already been manufactured and plans have already been made for how to distribute it. So a sequential timeline was moved to a consecutive timeline, and that's how it can be safely put out in such a short amount of time. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about how this vaccine works. Here's a picture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It isn't really red with purple spikes, but this allows us to talk about it more easily and visualize it. The purple spikes shown here are actually protrusions on the surface of the virus, and they're named the spikes. We know that if our bodies can make antibodies to these spike proteins, we can eliminate the virus. Here is a conceptual drawing of a messenger RNA vaccine. On the right is a large muscle cell, and on the left is the vaccine. Messenger RNA vaccines have strands of genetic material called RNA, inside of this special coating shown here. This coating helps the messenger RNA enter the muscle cells near the vaccine site. We have tons of messenger RNA in our bodies already. We make these by the millions and billions all day, every day. This messenger RNA is specific to the genetic information to code the spike protein for SARS-CoV-2. Since the protein is the only thing that's made from the vaccine, it doesn't harm the person who's vaccinated, but it directs our body, shown here, to make an immune response to the virus. There's no actual virus in the vaccine, and you can't catch COVID-19 from the vaccine. In the same manner, if you can't catch the virus from the vaccine, if you feel achy or have a low-grade fever the day after the vaccine, you're not transmitting the virus during that time either, because you haven't caught the virus from the vaccine. After the muscle cell makes the spike proteins, which are shown here, the cells break down the mRNA strands and eliminate them. It's important to note that the mRNA strand never enters your cell's nucleus, and it never affects your own genetic material. This counters the misinformation that we see all over the internet and social media that messenger RNA vaccines modify our genetic material. They don't. Once these spike proteins are produced, they cause our immune system to begin making those antibodies that I showed you a picture of and activating other immune cells to fight off what the body thinks is an infection. These antibodies are specific to SARS-CoV-2 virus, which means the immune system is now, after this vaccine, primed and ready to protect against future infection by the virus. I'd like to go over some vaccine safety data, and we're going to talk about the Pfizer vaccine specifically because that's the one we're getting here. This looks at side effects after one dose of the vaccine. The top bar and the top row are vaccine recipients compared to placebo recipients across the bottom half. You can see that there is some increase over placebo recipients of fatigue, headache, muscle and joint pain. After the second dose, these things actually were a little worse, with more fatigue and headache and chills compared to placebo recipients, more muscle and joint pain. These side effects all resolved within 48 to 72 hours at the very longest. When you give a vaccine to 30,000 people and watch them for 2 months, it is known that by chance, during that time, some people will have a heart attack anyway, some people will be diagnosed with cancer, some will have strokes, and life happens during that 2-month period. The question is, did it happen more in the vaccine recipients than it did in the placebo recipients? So if you look here, it was exactly the same. For cardiac disorders, nervous system disorders, infections, neoplasms, all of these things happened the same for vaccine versus placebo recipients. Also, it's known that during that 2-month period, out of 30,000 people, some of them will die by chance. Some will be killed in a car wreck, some will die of a heart attack, that deaths will happen in an expected number unrelated to the vaccine during the study period. That happened to 2 vaccine recipients and 4 placebo recipients. The 2 people that died during the study period were not believed to have any evidence of disease caused by COVID causing their death. Here's what we know about side effects from all the other vaccines that have been studied over decades. Serious side effects almost always occur within 2 months of vaccine. This includes anaphylaxis or serious allergic reaction. That happens within 2 hours from any vaccine on the market. We know that sometimes when children or adults get measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, they can develop low platelets temporarily. That happens at 3 to 4 weeks. With flu shots, about 1 in a million doses are believed to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, a form of transient paralysis. This always occurs within 6 weeks for those recipients. Pfizer presented 2 months worth of safety data for all of these vaccine recipients. So while we don't know what long-term side effects could be with these vaccines, it would be unlikely to expect any, but we can't say that's zero. Finally, I'd like to go over the vaccine efficacy data. When you think about vaccine versus placebo recipients, what you want to know is how many people caught COVID. If you look here, out of 17,000 vaccine recipients, 8 developed COVID disease. Out of 17,000 placebo recipients, 162 developed COVID disease, which means the vaccine is 95% effective at preventing COVID disease. When you look at serious disease, like being in the hospital or the ICU, and you ask how well the vaccine prevented serious disease, after the first dose of the vaccine, 1 vaccine recipient out of 21,000 had serious disease, compared with 14 people out of 21,000 placebo recipients. If you wait until after the second dose to look, no one in the vaccine series of 17,000 people got serious disease, and 5 people in the placebo group had serious disease. So for this time period, the vaccine was 100% efficacious at preventing serious COVID disease. What we don't know is whether the vaccine completely prevents all infection, or could some of these vaccine recipients have asymptomatic infection, meaning they could shed the virus and spread it to others, but not get sick themselves, and time will tell for those results.